June 27, 1977, Duluth, Minnesota. A morning nurse arrives at Glensheen Mansion for her 7 o'clock shift. The 39-room estate sits on 12 acres of Lake Superior shoreline Jacobean Revival architecture. Terraced gardens. One of the most beautiful homes in the Midwest. She enters through the main door. Immediately something feels wrong. The house is too quiet. Velma Pietila, the night nurse, should be awake, moving around, preparing to hand off her patient. The nurse walks toward the grand staircase. Then she sees it. A body. Velma Pietila, beaten to death. A brass candlestick lies nearby. The nurse runs upstairs. Elizabeth Congdon's bedroom door is open. The room has been ransacked. Drawers pulled out. A jewelry box missing. Elizabeth Congdon lies in her bed, 83 years old, partially paralyzed from a stroke. She's been suffocated with a satin pillow. 2 women murdered in one of Minnesota's grandest homes. The heiress to a mining fortune, killed in the mansion her father built 70 years earlier. Police arrive within minutes. The initial theory, robbery gone wrong. An intruder entered during the night. Velma tried to stop them. Both women died. But the truth was far darker. This wasn't random. This was family. The Glensheen murders would become Minnesota's most infamous crime, a case involving greed, manipulation, and a daughter desperate for her inheritance. A story that stretched from the iron mines of the Mesabi Range to the courtrooms where justice struggled to find answers. If you're interested in the dark side of America's Gilded Age fortunes, please consider subscribing. Your support is highly appreciated. Now, this is the story of how wealth built a palace and how greed destroyed the family inside it. Let's begin with that terrible morning. Chapter 1. The morning everything changed. The day nurse, whose name was never publicly released, arrived at Glensheen at 7 o'clock on Monday morning, June 27, 1977. She'd worked for Elizabeth Congdon for years. She knew the routine, the house, the layout. What to expect when she walked through those doors. Everything felt wrong immediately. The mansion was silent, too silent. Normally, Velma Pietila, the night nurse, would be moving around, preparing breakfast, getting Elizabeth ready for the day. The transition between shifts was always smooth, professional. They'd done this hundreds of times. But Velma wasn't in the kitchen. She wasn't in Elizabeth's room. The house felt empty in a way that made the nurse's skin crawl. She walked through the first floor, past the reception rooms, past the library with its thousands of books, past the breakfast room with its distinctive green tile walls. Everything looked normal, furniture in place, no obvious signs of disturbance. Then she reached the grand staircase. Velma Pietila lay at the bottom. Blood pooled around her head. A brass candlestick, bent from impact, lay a few feet away. The nurse ran upstairs. Elizabeth's bedroom door stood open. Dresser drawers had been pulled out, contents dumped. A jewelry box was missing from the dresser top. The room had been searched, ransacked. Elizabeth Congdon lay in her bed. The covers were pulled up neatly, almost peaceful. But something was wrong with her face. The color, the stillness. The nurse checked for a pulse. Nothing. Elizabeth was dead. A satin pillow lay next to her head. She ran back downstairs and called the police. Duluth Police Department arrived within 10 minutes. The responding officers immediately recognized the address. Everyone in Duluth knew Glensheen. The Congdon Mansion, one of the city's most prominent landmarks. A museum-quality estate still occupied by the family that built it. The officers entered cautiously. They found Velma Pietila first. The violence was obvious. She'd been beaten repeatedly. The candlestick had been used as a weapon. The attack was brutal, prolonged. This wasn't a single blow that accidentally killed someone. This was rage, or determination, or both. Upstairs, Elizabeth Congdon lay in her bed, 83 years old, partially paralyzed from a massive stroke 13 years earlier. She couldn't walk, could barely speak. She was completely helpless. Someone had suffocated her with a pillow, held it over her face until she stopped breathing. It would have taken several minutes. The killer had to stand there, pressing down, waiting for an elderly disabled woman to die. The bedroom told a story. Drawers opened, jewelry scattered, a jewelry box missing. The initial assessment was straightforward: burglary. An intruder had broken in during the night Velma had heard something. Came to investigate. The burglar panicked. Killed her. Then went upstairs and killed Elizabeth to eliminate witnesses. It was a reasonable theory. Wealthy homes got targeted. Glensheen sat on valuable lakefront property in a relatively isolated area. Large estates attracted criminals looking for easy targets. But the theory had problems. Nothing else was taken. The house was filled with valuable antiques, art, silver, collections worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. A burglar who went to the trouble of breaking into Glensheen would have taken more than one jewelry box. The violence was extreme. Velma had been beaten with shocking brutality. If the goal was robbery, why not flee after killing her? Why go upstairs and suffocate an elderly invalid who couldn't identify anyone? And the entry point bothered investigators. A window in the billiard room showed signs of forced entry. But the glass had fallen outside, not inside. Someone familiar with the house might know that detail mattered. Staged crime scenes often got small things wrong. By mid-morning, detectives were asking different questions. Who benefits from Elizabeth Congdon's death? Who knew the house layout? Who knew Elizabeth was helpless and Velma was the only person protecting her? The answers led to family. Elizabeth Congdon had 2 adopted daughters. Jennifer, who lived a quiet life and maintained good relationships with everyone. And Marjorie. Marjorie Congdon Leroy Caldwell. A woman with a reputation, a history, and serious financial problems. Within hours, investigators learned that Marjorie stood to inherit over $8 million when her mother died. They learned she was broke, house foreclosed, cars repossessed, living in a hotel in Colorado because she couldn't afford rent anywhere else. They learned her new husband, Roger Caldwell, was unemployed. That the couple had been cut off by the Congdon family trustees. That Marjorie had been begging for money for months. And they learned something else. Something that made the hair on the backs of their necks stand up. 3 months earlier, in March 1977, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation had contacted the Congdon family trustees. They'd received information that Marjorie Congdon Caldwell was looking for someone to kill her mother. The trustees had increased security at Glensheen, but Elizabeth had refused to believe her daughter would hurt her. She'd dismissed the warnings, insisted Marjorie loved her, would never do such a thing. Now Elizabeth was dead, suffocated in her bed, and detectives had to figure out if a daughter had murdered her mother for money. The Glensheen murders shocked Minnesota. This wasn't gang violence or a random street crime. This was a wealthy family, an iconic mansion. A beloved elderly woman and her dedicated nurse, both killed in the middle of the night. The case would consume the next 2 years. Trials, confessions, acquittals, a legal battle that revealed just how far some people would go for money. But to understand how it came to this, we need to go back to when Chester Congdon was just a struggling lawyer. Before the fortune, before the mansion, before everything that made Glensheen what it became. We need to understand how the Congdon fortune was built, because that fortune created everything that followed, including murder. Chapter 2, Chester Congdon, the mining lawyer. Chester Adgate. Congdon was born on June 12, 1853, in Rochester, New York. His father was a Methodist minister. His mother came from a respectable but not wealthy family. Chester grew up with modest means, religious values, and an understanding that success would require hard work. Nothing about his childhood suggested he'd become one of the wealthiest men in Minnesota. He attended Syracuse University in 1871. There he met Clara Hesperia Bannister, daughter of another Methodist minister from San Francisco. They both graduated in 1875. Chester studied law. Clara took a teaching position at a women's college in Ontario. They stayed in touch, wrote letters, made plans for a future together. But Chester needed to establish himself financially before he could marry. The years after graduation were difficult. He studied law under a firm in Syracuse and was admitted to the New York bar in 1877. But work was scarce, money even scarcer. He wrote Clara letters filled with self-doubt, called himself a second-rate lawyer, joked bitterly that he should have become a cowboy instead. In 1878, desperate for income, he took a job as a school principal in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. The pay was terrible, the work unfulfilling. He lasted less than a year. In 1879, Chester moved to St. Paul, Minnesota. He opened a law practice and was admitted to the Minnesota bar. The practice did modestly well. Enough to survive, not enough to thrive. Then his fortunes changed. He met William Bilson, the United States District Attorney for the state of Minnesota. The two men hit it off immediately. When a position opened, Chester became Bilson's assistant. The pay improved slightly. More importantly, he gained valuable connections and experience. Chester borrowed several $100s from a friend and proposed to Clara. On September 29, 1881, 10 years after they first met at Syracuse, they married in a small ceremony. The Congdons settled into life in St. Paul. Chester continued working as assistant district attorney. They lived modestly on Selby Avenue, near the upper-class Summit Avenue neighborhood, but not quite in it. They couldn't afford Summit Avenue, not yet. Their first child, Walter Bannister Congdon, was born in 1883, then Edward in 1885, Marjorie in 1887. The family was growing, the expenses mounting. Chester's salary barely covered it all. In 1892, William Bilson made Chester an offer. Bilson had left the district attorney position and established a private practice in Duluth. The city was booming. The Mesabi Iron Range, 60 miles north, had just been discovered. Duluth was becoming a shipping hub. Money was flowing. Legal work was plentiful. Bilson wanted a partner, someone he trusted, someone smart enough to handle complex cases. Chester accepted. The Congdon family moved to Duluth in May 1892. They rented a house at 1530 East 1st Street. The firm of Bilson and Congdon quickly earned a reputation for expertise in civil litigation, but the move to Duluth brought tragedy. Their son John Robert, nearly 2 years old, died in May 1893 from scarlet fever. The loss devastated Clara and Chester. They buried him in Duluth. A daughter, Elizabeth Mannering, was born in April 1894. Then Robert in 1898. The family kept growing despite the grief. In 1896, the Congdons purchased their own home, a 3-story Victorian masterpiece called the Redstone, faced in Red Lake Superior sandstone. The house at 1511 East Superior Street had been designed by renowned Duluth architect Oliver Traffhagen. It was substantial, impressive, the kind of house that announced a family on the rise. Chester's law practice was doing well, but what really changed everything was iron ore. The Mesabi Iron Range had been discovered in 1890 by Leonidas and Alfred Merritt. They'd found something extraordinary. Hematite ore lying close to the surface, rich deposits. Easy to extract, the largest iron ore body on the planet. But the Merritts struggled to find investors. Most steel makers didn't trust ore that seemed too good to be true. Andrew Carnegie, who ran the largest steel company in America, dismissed Mesabi ore as a sample of dirt, inferior quality, not worth investment. Henry Oliver disagreed. He ran Oliver Steel in Pittsburgh, the second largest steel manufacturer in the country. Oliver traveled to Minnesota in 1892 to attend the Republican National Convention. After the convention, he visited Duluth and toured the Mesabi Range personally. He liked what he saw. The ore was real, high quality, massive quantities. This could transform American steel production. Oliver needed local legal representation to handle his Minnesota mining transactions. He went to William Bilson's office in Duluth. Bilson was away. On a tight schedule, Oliver reluctantly agreed to meet with Bilson's junior partner instead, Chester Congdon. The two men connected immediately. Both were staunch Republicans. Both understood business. Both saw the potential in the Mesabi Range. Oliver proposed a partnership. He would create the Oliver Mining Company. Chester would serve as the company's agent in Minnesota. leasing and purchasing mining property. In exchange, Chester would receive fees, commissions, and stock in the company. Chester accepted. It was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. Finally, a chance to build real wealth. For the next several years, Chester worked tirelessly for Oliver Mining. He negotiated leases, purchased property, handled legal disputes. His reputation grew. His income increased dramatically. The struggling lawyer was becoming a wealthy man. But the bigger fortunes were still ahead, because the Mesabi Iron Range attracted the attention of even larger players. John D. Rockefeller wanted control of the range. He saw iron ore as strategic to his oil empire. Andrew Carnegie, despite his earlier dismissal, changed his mind and aggressively pursued Mesabi properties. Henry Oliver was caught between two titans. Chester found himself in the middle of battles between some of the wealthiest, most powerful men in America. Rockefeller versus Carnegie. Oliver trying to maintain independence, millions of dollars at stake. The fate of American steel production hanging in the balance. In 1901, J.P. Morgan stepped in. Fearing the conflict would destabilize the national economy, Morgan brokered a deal. He bought out Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Oliver Mining's holdings, combined them into a new entity, United States Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar company in history. The consolidation made fortunes for everyone involved. Henry Oliver walked away wealthy. Chester Congdon, as a stockholder in Oliver Mining, saw his shares in the new U.S. Steel Corporation skyrocket in value. In 6 years, Chester's stock rose 555%. Almost overnight, he went from successful lawyer to one of the wealthiest men in Minnesota. His net worth climbed into the millions, the equivalent of tens of millions today. Chester didn't stop there. He purchased cheap mining land on the western Mesabi Range. Land others thought was worthless because the ore needed processing before it could be used in steel mills. Chester partnered with Guilford Hartley and convinced U.S. Steel to invest $10 million in a concentration plant to process the ore. When U.S. Steel built the plant, Chester and Hartley's land became extremely valuable. They leased it back to U.S. Steel at enormous profit. Chester diversified. He invested in copper mines in Arizona, partnering with former Oliver Mining president Thomas Cole to create the Calumet and Arizona Copper Company. He built an irrigation canal in Washington's Yakima Valley and developed fruit orchards. He served on boards of banks, mining companies, and hardware firms. By 1904, Chester had achieved his dream. He was, arguably, the richest man in Minnesota. Perhaps only railroad magnate James J. Hill had more money. Chester retired from active law practice. He was 51 years old, wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined as a struggling young lawyer. He and Clara had 7 children, a beautiful home on Superior Street, respect in the community, but Chester wanted something more, something that reflected his success, something that would last for generations. He wanted an estate, a mansion, a palace on Lake Superior that would announce to everyone that Chester Adgate Congdon had arrived. In 1905, he began planning what would become Glensheen. Chapter 3. Building Glensheen. Chester and Clara spent months planning their estate. They traveled, studied architecture, visited grand homes on the East Coast. They knew what they wanted. Not ostentatious like the Fifth Avenue palaces, not trying to impress New York society. This would be a family home. Substantial, beautiful, built to last centuries. They purchased land on the shore of Lake Superior, 12 acres between Tisher Creek and Bent Brook, heavily wooded. The property ran from London Road down to the lake. In 1905, this was considered far removed from downtown Duluth, almost rural, quiet. Clara wrote in her diary, "I will have quiet neighbors." She was referring to the cemetery west of their property. The location offered privacy, natural beauty, and those stunning views of the lake. Chester hired Clarence H. Johnston as architect. Johnston was Minnesota's most prominent designer. He'd created scores of public buildings, university campuses, and private residences. He understood how to combine beauty with practicality, how to build structures that would endure harsh Minnesota winters. Johnston proposed Jacobean Revival style. inspired by 17th century English country estates. Asymmetrical design, brick construction with granite trim, prominent gables, distinctive windows and chimneys. The style suggested old-world permanence without European pretension. For the landscape, Chester hired Charles Welford Levitt Jr. from New York. Levitt brought two young landscape architects, Anthony Morell and Arthur Nichols, to supervise on-site work. They would later become Minnesota's foremost landscape designers. William A. French Company handled interior design. Every room would have custom woodwork, carefully selected furnishings, and attention to detail that matched the exterior quality. Construction began in 1905. The project would take 3 years and 9 months. The challenges were immediate. The site was heavily wooded and sloped steeply toward the lake. Workers had to clear trees while preserving natural beauty, grade the land, create level areas for the house and gardens. It wasn't easy work. Chester wanted the estate to be modern and self-sufficient. Underground tunnels were dug from London Road to bring in water, gas, and power lines. This way utilities wouldn't mar the landscaping. The tunnel system also allowed coal delivery for the heating system without disturbing the grounds. Water for the gardens came from Tisher Creek, diverted into a 60,000-gallon reservoir between Superior Street and London Road. The reservoir is still in use today. Levitt designed the landscape to retain much of the original vegetation: birch trees, maples, spruce. He wove trails and rustic bridges through the natural growth. The driveway followed the land's natural contours, rather than cutting straight paths. But the estate also needed to function independently. Levitt included a large vegetable garden, greenhouse, orchard, and cow barn. The property would produce its own fruits, vegetables, and dairy products, tennis courts, a bowling green, a large pier on Lake Superior, a boathouse, 4 gardeners' cottages. The main house rose steadily. 39 rooms spread across multiple floors. 20,000 square feet of living space. The scale was enormous, but the design kept it from feeling cold or intimidating. Johnston used different woods throughout: Circassian walnut, mahogany, cypress, fumed oak, enameled birch, American walnut. Each room's furniture matched the wood used in that room's trim and paneling. The consistency created harmony. Rooms flowed naturally from one to another. The hallways featured original stenciling in arts and crafts style, hand-carved wood details, wall and ceiling coverings made from wool, silk, filled burlap, and gold leaf. Even the doors showed craftsmanship. Each door used 2 kinds of wood: oak on the hallway side, the room's signature wood on the interior side. The house incorporated the latest technology: central heating and humidification systems, mostly located in the lower level, a central vacuum system. Given electricity's unreliability in 1905, the house was equipped with both gas and electric lights. If power failed, gas lamps would provide backup. The lower level housed utilitarian spaces: milk room, laundry, butler's quarters, but also leisure areas, billiard room, recreation room. What the family called the Little Museum, a wing off the recreation room for displaying collections. Throughout the house, symbols appeared repeatedly: lions representing power, pineapples representing hospitality. Chester and Clara wanted visitors to understand both messages. This family had achieved success, but they welcomed guests warmly. The breakfast room became one of the house's highlights. John Bradstreet of Minneapolis designed it. Green tile covered the walls and floors. 3 walls of stained glass windows overlooked the terraced gardens, and Lake Superior beyond natural light flooded the space. It was simultaneously elegant and intimate. The dining room and library also featured lake views. Large windows brought the landscape inside. The formal gardens, designed to be viewed from these rooms, descended in terraces toward the water. The grand staircase rose through the center of the house: carved railings, art glass windows. The staircase wasn't just functional, it was a statement, a showcase of craftsmanship. Construction costs mounted steadily: labor, materials, custom woodwork. The final bill came to $854,000. Equivalent to over $22 million today, Chester paid without complaint. This wasn't extravagance for its own sake. This was building something permanent, something that would serve his family for generations. On November 24th, 1908, the Congdon family moved into Glensheen. The name came from two sources: Chester's ancestral village of Sheen in Surrey, England, and Glen, the Scottish word for narrow valley, referring to the ravines of Tisher Creek and Bent Brook that framed the property. The house was complete, the gardens planted, the staff hired. Glensheen was operational. Chester had achieved what he set out to create: a masterpiece of design and craftsmanship, a home that combined beauty, functionality, and technological advancement. An estate that announced his success while remaining fundamentally a family residence. Architectural historian Larry Millett would later call Glensheen warm and livable, with a surprising sense of intimacy, despite its size. Because the house remained in the Congdon family for 70 years, it stayed remarkably intact. Almost nothing changed. Original furnishings remained in their original places. Chester was 55 years old when Glensheen was completed. He'd built his fortune, built his dream home, established his family's position in Duluth society. He had 8 more years to enjoy it. In November 1916, Chester Congdon died of a pulmonary embolism in St. Paul. He was 63 years old. A life that began in modest circumstances, rose to extraordinary wealth, and ended too soon. Clara remained at Glensheen. She would live there for another 34 years, maintaining the house and gardens exactly as Chester had envisioned. The estate became her life's work, her tribute to the man who built it. But the house's story was far from over. The next chapters would be written by the children, particularly the youngest daughter, Elizabeth, the girl born in 1894, who grew up in that Victorian house on Superior Street. Elizabeth would inherit Glensheen. She would live there her entire adult life. She would adopt 2 daughters and raise them in those 39 rooms. And in 1977, she would die there, murdered in her bedroom while sleeping. Chapter 4. Life at the Estate. Glensheen required a staff of 20 to 30 people to function properly. The Congdons weren't trying to replicate European aristocracy. They wanted a smoothly running household that could accommodate their growing family and frequent guests. The butler managed male staff and oversaw formal service. The housekeeper supervised female servants and maintained household standards. Below them worked footmen, maids, cooks, kitchen staff, laundresses, and groundskeepers. Everyone had specific roles, clear hierarchies, defined responsibilities. Staff lived in the house. Upper floors held their quarters. Small rooms. Simple furnishings. Nothing like the elaborate spaces below. Servants used separate staircases. They weren't supposed to be visible unless actively serving. The system required constant coordination. The Congdons treated their employees well by the standards of the time. Fair wages, reasonable hours compared to other wealthy households. Clara ran the operation with efficiency rather than cruelty. Staff who worked well stayed for years. The family settled into routines. Chester maintained offices downtown, but often worked from Glensheen's library. The room held thousands of books, legal volumes, history literature. He could spend hours there, reading or handling correspondence. Clara managed the household and raised the children. By 1908, when they moved into Glensheen, the family included Walter, Edward, Marjorie, Helen, Elizabeth, and Robert. A 7th child, John, had died in infancy back in St. Paul. The children had the run of the estate, 12 acres to explore, trails through the woods, the lakeshore, tennis courts. In winter, they could ice skate. In summer, they swam and sailed. The property was essentially a private park. Formal meals happened in the dining room. The space could seat dozens, though family dinners were typically just the Congdons and perhaps a few guests. The room featured high windows, bright silk banners, and gleaming silver candlesticks' medieval atmosphere mixed with modern comfort. Interestingly, preserved condiment bottles from that era show the family kept mustard and ketchup on the table. Even millionaires wanted familiar tastes. The breakfast room saw daily use, that distinctive space with 3 walls of green tile and stained glass. Every morning, the family gathered there. Lake views, natural light Clara believed starting the day properly mattered. Breakfast together kept the family connected despite their individual schedules. Chester collected art, American painters mostly, Charles Warren Eaton, Childa Hassam, Albert Laurie Grohl. The collection hung throughout Glensheen, displayed as Chester intended, not stored away, not rotated. Each painting had its place. The house functioned as both home and private gallery. The family also welcomed guests regularly. Dinner parties, afternoon teas, garden gatherings. The terraced gardens provided perfect settings for outdoor entertaining. Clara had specific days for receiving callers. Social obligations came with the Congdon name and fortune. Chester remained involved in business and politics even after retiring from active law practice. He served on multiple corporate boards, invested in new ventures. In 1909, he ran for the Minnesota state legislature. His goal was opposing a proposed tonnage tax on iron ore shipped out of state. The tax threatened his western Mesabi investments. Chester won election. He served 2 terms from 1909 to 1913. He commuted between Duluth and St. Paul during legislative sessions. The work took him away from Glensheen for weeks at a time, but he felt the cause justified the absence. His political efforts succeeded. The tonnage tax bill failed. Chester's business interests were protected. Minnesota eventually passed such a tax in 1921, 5 years after his death. But by then, the Congdon fortune was secure. Throughout these years, Elizabeth was growing up at Glensheen. Born in 1894, she was 14 when the family moved into the estate. The house became the center of her world. She knew every room, every trail, every view of the lake. Unlike her siblings, Elizabeth never seemed eager to leave. Walter went off to college. Edward pursued his own interests. Marjorie and Helen eventually married. Robert prepared for university. They all moved on with their lives, establishing homes elsewhere. Elizabeth stayed. She attended social functions, had friends, traveled occasionally, but Glensheen remained home, the place she belonged. She never married. This wasn't particularly unusual for wealthy women of her generation. Some chose independence over the obligations that came with marriage. Elizabeth appeared content with her life at the estate, helping Clara manage the household, involving herself in Duluth society, and maintaining the family presence. Then, in November 1916, Chester died. The pulmonary embolism struck suddenly. He was only 63, at the height of his influence, still active in business, still planning projects. His death shocked Duluth. Memorial services drew hundreds. Tributes emphasized his contributions to the city and state, the development of the Iron Range, his political service, his philanthropy, which he'd kept quiet during his lifetime. Chester left his fortune in trust. Clara would receive income for life. After her death, the estate would be divided among the surviving children. The structure protected the wealth, ensured it would support multiple generations, prevented any single heir from squandering everything. Clara continued living at Glensheen. She maintained the house exactly as Chester had left it. The staff, the gardens, the furnishings, everything stayed in place. She was preserving his vision, keeping his memory alive. The 1920s and 30s passed. The children grew older, started their own families. Grandchildren appeared. Glensheen hosted family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and summer visits. Clara aged gracefully. She remained sharp, capable, in control of the household well into her 80s. Staff respected her. Family deferred to her. Glensheen was her domain. In 1950, Clara Congdon died at age 96. She'd lived at Glensheen for 42 years. Longer than Chester. Long enough to see the estate become a Duluth landmark, a symbol of the family's lasting prominence. After Clara's death, the question became, what happens to Glensheen? The other children had their own homes, their own lives. None wanted the burden of maintaining the massive estate. The costs were substantial. Property taxes, staff salaries, heating bills in brutal Minnesota winters, constant maintenance and repairs. Elizabeth was the logical choice. She'd never left. Glensheen was already her home. The house would pass to her. She inherited the estate and continued living there. Now she was responsible for everything. The decisions, the expenses, the preservation of what her parents had built. By this point, Elizabeth was in her 50s, still unmarried. Living alone in 39 rooms seemed impractical. The solution came through adoption. In 1932, Elizabeth adopted her first daughter, an infant originally named Jacqueline Barnes. Elizabeth renamed her Marjorie Mannering Congdon. 3 years later, in 1935, Elizabeth adopted a second daughter, Jennifer Susan Congdon. The house had children again. The rooms that had been quiet for years filled with sounds of young girls, toys, laughter, the energy that comes with raising a family. Elizabeth devoted herself to her daughters. She hired nurses and nannies to help, enrolled them in good schools, introduced them to Duluth society, gave them everything the Congdon name could provide. Marjorie and Jennifer grew up at Glensheen. They experienced childhood similar to what Elizabeth had known: the estate, the lake, the privilege that came with the family fortune. But there were differences, important ones. These girls were adopted, not blood Congdons. Some family members never quite accepted them, treated them differently, made subtle distinctions between real family and adopted children. Marjorie seemed to feel this more acutely. She was temperamental, difficult, required more attention than Jennifer. Elizabeth struggled sometimes to manage her older daughter's moods and demands. Still, life at Glensheen continued. The years passed. The house aged gracefully. Very little changed inside. Original furnishings remained. The gardens were maintained. Glensheen looked almost exactly as it had in 1908. Then, in 1964, disaster struck. Elizabeth suffered a massive stroke. She was 70 years old. The stroke left her partially paralyzed. She lost mobility on one side. Her speech became impaired. She couldn't walk, required a wheelchair, needed constant care. Suddenly, the woman who'd run Glensheen for decades couldn't manage her own daily needs. She required round-the-clock nursing, someone to help her eat, dress, move from bed to chair, someone to monitor her health constantly. Nurses were hired, day shifts and night shifts. The routine Elizabeth had maintained for so long now depended entirely on paid caregivers and her daughter's involvement. In 1968, Elizabeth made a decision. She donated Glensheen to the University of Minnesota Duluth. The university would own the property after her death, but Elizabeth retained a life estate. She could live there as long as she survived. After she died, the university would take possession. The decision made sense. None of her daughters wanted to maintain the property. Marjorie was married with 7 children, living elsewhere. Jennifer had her own life. The estate needed an institutional owner who could preserve it permanently. This arrangement meant Elizabeth could live out her days at Glensheen, die in the house where she'd spent her entire life. The university would convert it to a museum, eventually open it to the public, share the beauty and history with everyone. Elizabeth's health declined slowly through the 1970s. The paralysis never improved. She remained wheelchair-bound, increasingly fragile, but her mind stayed relatively sharp. She could still communicate, make decisions, and recognize family. By 1977, Elizabeth was 83. She required complete care, couldn't be left alone. The nurses managed everything. She had no idea her daughter Marjorie was desperately broke in Colorado. No idea the trustees had cut Marjorie off from family money. No idea Marjorie's new husband Roger was unemployed, and the couple was living in a hotel because they'd lost their house. And she had no idea that in June 1977, someone would break into Glensheen in the middle of the night, kill her nurse, walk upstairs to her bedroom, and suffocate her with a pillow. The house Chester built to last for generations would become the scene of one of Minnesota's most shocking crimes. Chapter 5. Elizabeth, the heiress who never married. Elizabeth Mannering Congdon was born on April 22, 1894, in the Redstone House on Superior Street. She was Chester and Clara's fifth child, the fourth to survive past infancy. She grew up watching her father build his fortune, from modest success to extraordinary wealth, from the Victorian house to planning Glensheen. She was 14 when the family moved into the completed mansion in 1908. Unlike her siblings, Elizabeth never seemed to chafe against the boundaries of Duluth society. Walter pursued business ventures. Edward had his own interests. Marjorie and Helen married and started families Robert prepared for a career. They all eventually left. Elizabeth stayed. Content with the life Glensheen offered, the social obligations, the family expectations, the comfort and security that came with the Congdon name. She attended appropriate schools, participated in Duluth social circles, had friends among other wealthy families. She traveled occasionally, visited relatives, saw other parts of the country, but she always returned to the estate on Lake Superior. Marriage never happened. This wasn't scandalous for a woman of her generation and class. Many wealthy women chose independence over the obligations that came with husbands and their families. Some found fulfillment in other pursuits, charity work, cultural activities, managing family affairs. Elizabeth appeared satisfied with her role at Glensheen. She helped Clara manage the household, oversaw staff when needed, participated in the endless social calendar that came with the Congdon position. She was dutiful, reliable, the daughter who stayed close to home. When Chester died in 1916, Elizabeth was 22, young enough that marriage still seemed possible. But the years passed without any serious prospects. She settled into life as Clara's companion and helper. After Clara's death in 1950, Elizabeth inherited the estate. She was 56 years old, a middle-aged woman living alone in a 39-room mansion. The loneliness must have been profound, walking through rooms designed for a large family, eating meals in a dining room built for dozens. The staff provided company, but they were employees, not family. The distance always remained. Elizabeth made her decision in 1932. She would adopt. The first baby arrived that year, an infant girl originally named Jacqueline Barnes. Elizabeth renamed her Marjorie Mannering Congdon. The Mannering honored Elizabeth's own middle name, the Congdon, gave her full family status. 3 years later, in 1935, a second adoption, another infant girl, Jennifer Susan Congdon. Suddenly, Glensheen had children again. Nurseries were set up. Nurses and nannies hired. The rooms that had been silent filled with the sounds of babies crying, then toddlers playing, then young girls running through halls. Elizabeth threw herself into motherhood. She was 41 when Jennifer arrived. Not young by the standards of the time, but wealthy enough to afford all the help she needed. The nurses handled night feedings and constant care. Elizabeth provided love, attention, and the Congdon name. The girls grew up with every advantage. Fine schools, beautiful clothes, summer trips. They learned to sail on Lake Superior, played tennis on the estate courts, attended social functions appropriate to their age and position. But there were complications. Complications Elizabeth might not have fully anticipated. Marjorie was difficult from early on. Temperamental, demanding. She threw tantrums that seemed excessive even for a child, required constant attention, pushed boundaries repeatedly. Nurses struggled to manage her moods. Jennifer was quieter, easier. She followed rules, accepted discipline, caused minimal problems. The contrast between the two girls became obvious early. Some extended Congdon family members never fully accepted the adoptions. They were polite, correct in their behavior. But distinctions remained: blood relatives versus adopted children, real Congdons versus something else. Marjorie seemed to sense this rejection. It fed her resentment, made her more difficult. She acted out, caused scenes, embarrassed Elizabeth at family gatherings. As Marjorie entered her teenage years, the problems intensified. She spent money recklessly, expected Elizabeth to cover every expense without question. When limits were set, she became furious, accused her mother of not loving her, threatened dramatic actions. Elizabeth tried patience, understanding, professional help. Nothing seemed to work. Marjorie remained volatile, unpredictable, manipulative. In 1951, at age 19, Marjorie married Richard Leroy. They started having children immediately, 7 eventually. The marriage lasted 19 years, ending in divorce in 1970. During those years, Marjorie's financial problems became legendary within the family. She and Richard lived beyond their means constantly, borrowed money, fell behind on payments. Turned to Elizabeth whenever creditors closed in. Elizabeth paid. Again and again, she bailed out her daughter, covered debts, kept Marjorie from facing consequences. Maternal love mixed with enabling. The pattern was established early and never changed. Jennifer, meanwhile, lived a quiet life. She married, maintained good relationships with family, caused Elizabeth no serious problems. The dutiful daughter. The contrast must have pained Elizabeth. One daughter who brought constant worry, another who provided only comfort. But mothers love their children regardless. Elizabeth continued supporting Marjorie despite everything. In 1964, Elizabeth suffered a massive stroke. She was 70 years old. The attack hit without warning, sudden, devastating. The stroke left her partially paralyzed on one side. She lost the ability to walk. Her speech became severely impaired. She could barely communicate, couldn't dress herself, couldn't feed herself, couldn't manage any of the basic functions of daily life. Elizabeth was confined to a wheelchair, required round-the-clock nursing care. Someone had to be with her constantly, monitoring, helping, ensuring her basic needs were met. The woman who'd managed Glensheen for decades now couldn't manage herself. The independence she'd valued was gone. She was completely dependent on others. Day nurses and night nurses were hired. They worked in shifts. Velma Piatila became one of her regular caregivers until retirement. The nurses handled everything, feeding, dressing, moving Elizabeth from bed to wheelchair, administering medications, managing her care. Elizabeth's condition never improved. The paralysis was permanent, the speech impairment lasting. She would spend the rest of her life disabled, trapped in a body that no longer worked properly. But her mind remained relatively functional. She could think, recognize people, understand what was said to her, make her wishes known through limited speech and gestures. The awareness of her condition might have been the cruelest part, knowing what she'd lost, unable to recover it. In 1968, Elizabeth made arrangements for Glensheen's future. She donated the property to the University of Minnesota Duluth. After her death, it would become a museum open to the public, preserved permanently. She retained a life estate. She could live at Glensheen until she died. Then the university would take possession. The arrangement gave her security while ensuring the house would survive. Her fortune was held in various trusts, some established by her father Chester decades earlier, others created more recently. The structure was complex. Multiple trustees managed the money-distributed income to beneficiaries, protected the principal from being depleted. Marjorie received income from the trusts, but the trustees controlled distribution. They could cut her off if they deemed spending too reckless. They had that authority written into the trust documents. Elizabeth's will, updated in December 1976, specified distributions after her death. Marjorie and Jennifer would inherit substantial sums. Over $8 million for Marjorie. The exact amount depended on various trust provisions and estate calculations, but until Elizabeth died, the money remained locked in trusts. Marjorie couldn't access the principal. Only the income the trustees approved. This created tension. Marjorie needed money constantly. The trustees increasingly refused. They'd watched her blow through funds for years, watched her accumulate debts, watched her make terrible financial decisions repeatedly. By 1977, the relationship between Marjorie and the trustees had deteriorated completely. They wouldn't give her anything beyond minimal support. She was furious, desperate, running out of options. Elizabeth, wheelchair-bound and barely able to speak, couldn't intervene effectively. She still loved Marjorie, still wanted to help. but she'd given control to the trustees precisely because she knew Marjorie couldn't handle money responsibly. The situation was impossible. A daughter who needed cash immediately, trustees who refused to provide it, a mother who was wealthy on paper but couldn't access enough to solve the problem, and an inheritance worth millions that would only pay out when Elizabeth died. Elizabeth spent her days in the second-floor bedroom, looking out at Lake Superior, the water she'd watched her entire life. The view from the house her father built. She'd lived at Glensheen for 69 years, longer than anyone, longer than Chester, longer than Clara. She had no way of knowing that her daughter Marjorie, desperate and broke in Colorado, was discussing increasingly desperate solutions. No way of knowing that Marjorie's new husband Roger was willing to do things Marjorie herself might hesitate to attempt. No way of knowing that on the night of June 26, 1977, someone would enter Glensheen through a billiard room window, kill the night nurse trying to protect her walk upstairs to her bedroom, and press a pillow over her face until she stopped breathing. Chapter 6. Marjorie, the Problem Daughter. Marjorie Congdon came into the world as Jacqueline Barnes, an infant whose biological parents couldn't keep her. In 1932, Elizabeth adopted her and gave her the Congdon name a new identity, a new future. The early warning signs appeared young. Tantrums that lasted for hours, demands that seemed excessive even for a child, an inability to accept the word no without explosive reactions. Elizabeth attributed it to adjustment, adoption trauma, the confusion of being raised by someone who wasn't her birth mother. She hired specialists, sought advice, tried different approaches. Nothing worked. Marjorie remained difficult. As she grew older, the problems evolved. She developed a sense of entitlement that shocked even people accustomed to wealthy children. Money meant nothing to her. Spending limits didn't exist. If she wanted something, she expected to get it immediately. Elizabeth indulged her, paid bills, covered expenses, made excuses to family members who raised eyebrows at Marjorie's behavior. Maternal love mixed with denial. The pattern would repeat for decades. Jennifer, 3 years younger, provided stark contrast, quiet, obedient, grateful for what she had. She caused Elizabeth no serious trouble, made no scenes. The difference between the two girls couldn't have been more obvious. Some family members whispered about nature versus nurture. Was Marjorie born with these tendencies, or did Elizabeth's parenting create them? The debate was pointless. By adolescence, Marjorie's personality was set. In 1951, 19-year-old Marjorie married Richard Leroy. He was a decent man, hardworking. He had no idea what he was getting into. The marriage produced 7 children rapidly. By any measure, this should have brought stability, responsibility. The demands of raising a large family should have matured Marjorie. Instead, the children became additional expenses she couldn't manage. 7 mouths to feed, 7 bodies to clothe, 7 tuitions to pay. Marjorie spent money faster than Richard could earn it. They lived in Marine on St. Croix, Minnesota, a pleasant community, good schools, the kind of place where raising children should have been straightforward. But the Leroy household operated in constant crisis. Bills went unpaid, creditors called, collection agencies sent letters. Richard worked longer hours trying to keep up. Marjorie blamed him for not earning enough. The fights escalated. She turned to Elizabeth constantly. Needed money for this, needed money for that. Emergency after emergency. Elizabeth paid. Every time. She couldn't stand the thought of her daughter or grandchildren suffering. The trustees managing the Congdon fortune watched with growing alarm. They saw the pattern. Money going to Marjorie disappeared instantly. Nothing was ever enough. No amount satisfied her. But Elizabeth insisted. These were her grandchildren. Her daughter needed help. The trustees reluctantly approved distributions, knowing the money would vanish. Then came the fire. In the late 1960s, the Leroy house in Marine on St. Croix burned under suspicious circumstances. Insurance investigation raised questions. The timing seemed convenient. The family was deeply in debt. The insurance payout would solve immediate problems. Nothing was ever proven. But family members remembered, whispered, added it to the growing list of incidents involving Marjorie. By 1970, the marriage collapsed. Richard filed for divorce after 19 years. The financial burden, the constant chaos, the impossibility of maintaining any stability, he'd had enough. Marjorie got custody of the children initially, but she couldn't manage them, couldn't afford them. Several eventually went to live with Richard. Marjorie had failed at motherhood the way she failed at everything requiring discipline or sacrifice. After the divorce, she moved to Colorado in 1975. A fresh start, new surroundings, distance from Minnesota, relatives who'd grown tired of her problems. She left most of her children behind. 7 kids who needed their mother. She abandoned them, chose her own freedom over their needs. It was perhaps the clearest indication of who Marjorie really was. In Colorado, she met Roger Caldwell. He was recently divorced, struggling financially, working odd jobs, not particularly successful. In many ways, he matched Marjorie perfectly. 2 people with more ambition than ability, more needs than resources. They married quickly in 1976. Marjorie was 44, Roger was in his 40s. Both were starting over after failed first marriages. Both were broke. They hatched plans, big plans, a horse ranch. They'd breed and train horses, sell them for profit, build a successful operation that would finally make Marjorie wealthy in her own right, prove she didn't need the Congdon trustees controlling her life. The ranch idea required land, money, equipment, expertise they didn't have. But Marjorie was convinced it would work. Roger went along. He'd learned quickly that disagreeing with Marjorie only caused problems. They purchased property for the ranch, bought horses, made grand plans. The problem was financing. They had no real capital. Everything was leveraged, borrowed, pledged against future income that might never materialize. Within months, they couldn't make payments. The property was foreclosed. The horses were sold or repossessed. The ranch dream collapsed before it really started. They moved into the Holland House Hotel in Golden, Colorado, living in a hotel because they couldn't qualify for an apartment lease, couldn't come up with security deposits, had no rental history that didn't include evictions or unpaid bills. Hotel living was expensive, far more than renting would have cost. But it was the only option, pay weekly, no credit check required, no long-term commitment. The money came from Marjorie's trust income. She received approximately $22,000 per year from one of the Congdon trusts. In 1977, that was decent money enough to live modestly. But Marjorie had never lived modestly. $22,000 might as well have been nothing. It disappeared instantly. Hotel bills, meals out, Marjorie's shopping, Roger's expenses. It was never enough. By spring 1977, they were desperate. The hotel bills were mounting. They had no income beyond the trust payment. Roger couldn't find steady work. They'd burned through credit. Nobody would lend them money. Marjorie tried multiple approaches with the trustees. She needed money for this emergency, that crisis. Every request was denied. The trustees had seen this before. Giving Marjorie more money solved nothing. It just vanished. In March 1977, something alarming happened. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation contacted the Congdon family trustees. They'd received information that Marjorie was looking for someone to kill her mother, a hitman. Marjorie was supposedly asking around, trying to find someone who'd murder Elizabeth for money. The information came from law enforcement sources. They took it seriously enough to warn the family. The trustees increased security at Glensheen. They informed Elizabeth, though she refused to believe her daughter would hurt her. Elizabeth insisted there must be a misunderstanding. Marjorie loved her, would never do such a thing. The trustees weren't convinced. They knew Marjorie better than Elizabeth wanted to admit. They'd watched her manipulate, lie, scheme. They'd seen the fires, the debts, the destroyed relationships. Nothing was beyond her if she was desperate enough. But what could they do? Lock Marjorie up based on a rumor? Prevent her from seeing her mother? Elizabeth wouldn't allow it. Despite everything, she loved her daughter, wanted to believe the best of her. By June 1977, the Caldwells were in crisis. The hotel was threatening eviction for unpaid bills. They had no money, no prospects, no options, except one. Elizabeth's death would trigger inheritance distributions. Over $8 million would come to Marjorie. The trusts would pay out. All the money that had been locked away suddenly available. 3 days before Elizabeth's death, Marjorie signed a document, a power of attorney. It authorized Roger to receive approximately $2.5 million of her expected inheritance directly to him, not through her, not subject to the trustee's control. The timing would later seem damning. Why would she sign such a document unless something was about to happen? Unless Roger was about to do something that earned him that money? On the weekend of June 24th through 26th, Roger disappeared from the hotel. He left a note for Marjorie's 16-year-old son, Rick. Said he and Marjorie would be with real estate agents all weekend, left $50 for Rick to use for dates and gas. The real estate agent never saw Roger that weekend. Marjorie was there. Roger wasn't. He was gone. Missing for 3 days. Nobody could place him anywhere during those critical 72 hours. No airline records, no credit card receipts, no witnesses who remembered seeing him. He'd vanished. Then, early Monday morning, June 27th, Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Pietila were found murdered at Glensheen. Roger reappeared at the hotel Monday afternoon. He had bruises on his face, cuts on his hands. When asked, he claimed a horse had kicked him. The explanation seemed odd for someone who supposedly spent the weekend looking at real estate in suburban Denver. Marjorie called her sister Jennifer with the news. Their mother was dead, murdered. They needed to come to Duluth for the funeral. Marjorie's reaction seemed off to people who knew her. Not quite right, too composed, too ready with explanations, as if she'd been expecting this news. At the funeral 3 days later, relatives noticed Roger's injuries, his nervousness, the way he avoided eye contact. Something about the Caldwells didn't feel right. Family members approached investigators, told them about Marjorie's financial problems, the hitman rumor from March, the pattern of fires and suspicious incidents, the inheritance worth millions. They urged police to look closely at Marjorie and Roger. What police would discover over the next weeks was damning. Evidence that placed Roger at Glensheen. Physical proof connecting him to the crime. A trail that led directly back to the desperate couple in Colorado who needed Elizabeth dead. The question wasn't whether Roger killed them. The evidence would prove that beyond doubt. The question was Marjorie's involvement. Did she order it? Plan it? Encourage it? Or was Roger acting alone to secure the inheritance that would save them both? Chapter 7. The Evidence Mounts. Duluth police began building their case within hours of discovering the bodies. The physical proof told a compelling story. The question was whether it would hold up in court. Investigators photographed everything. The billiard room window with glass fragments outside rather than inside. Velma Pietila's body at the base of the grand staircase. The bent brass candlestick. Elizabeth's bedroom with drawers pulled out and contents scattered. The missing jewelry box. They dusted for fingerprints. Collected hair samples. Documented every detail of the crime scene. Modern forensics in 1977 couldn't do DNA testing or the sophisticated analysis available today, but careful collection could still solve cases. The missing jewelry box became a critical clue. Someone had taken it. A burglar would have grabbed more. The house was filled with valuable items. Art, silver, antiques worth thousands. Taking only one jewelry box suggested someone who wanted the crime to look like robbery, but didn't actually care about stealing. Velma Pietila's car was found the next morning. Airport parking lot. Keys still inside. Whoever killed her had driven the car there and abandoned it. Why the airport? Either to catch a flight, or to make investigators think someone had caught a flight. Police began checking airline passenger manifests, flights from Minneapolis to Denver in the days before and after the murder. If Roger Caldwell had flown to Minnesota, killed 2 women, and flown back to Colorado, there should be records. They found nothing. No Roger Caldwell on any passenger list. No aliases that matched his description. No credit card receipts for tickets. It was as if he'd never traveled, or traveled under methods that left no paper trail. But other material was accumulating. A week after the murders, investigators received a peculiar lead. A coin dealer in Colorado contacted them. Someone had mailed him a Byzantine gold coin asking for an appraisal. The return address was Roger Caldwell's. The coin matched the description of items from Elizabeth's jewelry collection. Why would Roger mail himself a stolen coin? It made no sense, unless he was incredibly stupid or incredibly arrogant, or establishing some kind of proof that the job was done. Detectives obtained a search warrant for the Caldwell's hotel room. What they found was damning. More jewelry matching descriptions of items taken from Glensheen. A wicker basket similar to the missing jewelry box Roger tried claiming Marjorie's grandmother had given her these things years ago. The story fell apart quickly. Then came the fingerprint. On the envelope containing the gold coin, a thumbprint that would become the prosecution's most powerful weapon. The print belonged to Roger Caldwell. Definitively. No question. Roger had mailed himself stolen property from a murder scene, put his thumbprint on the envelope, created proof that directly connected him to the crime. It was almost unbelievable. But the most damning findings were visual. When Roger and Marjorie arrived in Duluth for Elizabeth's funeral on June 30th, relatives noticed immediately. Roger's face was bruised cut. His hands showed injuries, scratches and marks consistent with a violent struggle. Marjorie explained quickly, a horse had kicked him. Just an accident. Nothing to do with anything else. The explanation satisfied no one. Roger looked like he'd been in a fight. The kind of fight that happens when you beat someone to death with a brass candlestick. Investigators interviewed the Caldwells separately. Their stories had inconsistencies, small details that didn't match. Roger claimed he'd been in Colorado all weekend, but he couldn't explain where exactly. No witnesses confirmed his presence. No credit card receipts. No restaurant bills. Nothing. Marjorie insisted Roger had been with her, looking at real estate, planning their future. But the real estate agent said she'd only seen Marjorie. Roger hadn't been there. Marjorie changed her story, said she must have been confused about which day Roger accompanied her. The lies were piling up. Each contradiction made the Caldwells look more guilty. On July 6, 1977, police arrested Roger Caldwell. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Elizabeth Congdon, Velma Pietala. He was charged with killing them both in order to speed his wife's inheritance. Roger maintained his innocence, claimed he was being framed, that someone was setting him up. He'd never been to Duluth that weekend, never entered Glensheen, never touched those women. The whole case was planted, the story ridiculous, but the material kept mounting. Forensic analysis of the wicker basket found in their hotel room. Fibers that matched materials from Glensheen, hair samples, soil from the estate grounds. Each test added another piece to the prosecution's case. Marjorie wasn't arrested immediately. Police were still building their argument against her. They believed she'd planned it, ordered it. But proving conspiracy required more than suspicion. They needed hard proof of her involvement. That came through financial records. The power of attorney signed 3 days before the murders, authorizing Roger to receive $2.5 million of her inheritance. The timing was too perfect, too calculated. You don't sign such a document unless you expect money to arrive soon. Investigators also learned about previous incidents. The house fire in Marine on St. Croix. Suspicious but never proven. An incident years earlier when Elizabeth became violently ill after eating marmalade Marjorie had brought her. Blood tests showed drugs not among Elizabeth's prescriptions. The marmalade jar conveniently disappeared before it could be tested. Rebecca Leroy, one of Marjorie's daughters, provided devastating testimony to investigators. She claimed her mother had once tried to strangle her, that Marjorie was capable of violence when money was involved. The statement painted a picture of a dangerous woman. On July 7th, authorities arrested Marjorie. charged her with conspiracy to commit murder, aiding and abetting, being an accomplice to 2 killings. She was released on $100,000 bond. The Congdon family wealth, ironically, allowed her to await trial in relative comfort. The legal machinery ground forward. Roger's trial was scheduled first. Change of venue granted due to pretrial publicity. The case moved to Brainerd, Minnesota, Crow Wing County, supposedly a location where jurors hadn't been saturated with news coverage. The prosecution felt confident they had physical proof: Roger's fingerprint on the envelope, the stolen jewelry in his possession, his injuries, his inability to account for his whereabouts. Witnesses who placed him in Minnesota, despite the lack of airline records. The defense strategy was interesting. Roger's lawyers argued he was being framed. By whom? Other Congdon family members. Specifically, they suggested Jennifer or other relatives who stood to benefit from Elizabeth's death. That someone else had committed the murders and planted clues to implicate Roger. The theory seemed desperate, but all the defense needed was reasonable doubt. If even one juror believed the possibility of a frame-up, Roger might walk. The trial began in July 1978, exactly 1 year after the murders. The prosecution presented methodically, building their case piece by piece. The stolen jewelry found in Roger's hotel room, the wicker basket matching the missing jewelry box, the Byzantine gold coin mailed to himself, his fingerprint on the envelope, the injuries visible at the funeral, his missing whereabouts the weekend of the murders, financial desperation, motive worth $8 million. The defense tried attacking each element, suggested the jewelry could have been gifts, that the fingerprint might have gotten on the envelope innocently, that the injuries came from a horse kick, just as Marjorie claimed. That lack of airline records proved Roger couldn't have traveled to Minnesota, but the cumulative weight was crushing. Too many coincidences, too much physical documentation, too many lies that didn't hold up under scrutiny. One piece the prosecution couldn't produce: actual proof of how Roger traveled to and from Minnesota. No airline tickets, no rental car records, no bus tickets. He'd supposedly made the trip invisibly. The defense hammered this point. How could Roger have traveled 1,500 miles without leaving any trace? The prosecution suggested he might have driven, stolen a car, hitchhiked, paid cash for everything, traveled under a fake name. There were ways to move without documentation. If you planned carefully, Roger had 3 days to get there and back. It was physically possible. The jury deliberated for 3 days, then returned their verdict. Guilty. Both counts. First-degree murder. 2 consecutive life sentences. Roger Caldwell was going to prison, probably forever. He'd killed 2 women for money that would never benefit him now. The inheritance would be tied up in legal battles for years. Even if Marjorie eventually received it, Roger would be behind bars. The conviction energized prosecutors. Now they moved forward with Marjorie's trial. If they could convict the husband, they could convict the wife who'd orchestrated everything. But Marjorie's trial would prove far more difficult. She hadn't been at Glensheen that night, hadn't touched the murder weapons, hadn't left fingerprints or physical traces. Proving conspiracy required showing she'd planned, encouraged, or ordered the killings. That was harder than proving Roger had actually done them. And Marjorie had advantages Roger lacked. Money for the best legal representation. The Congdon name still carried weight. She could present herself as a grieving daughter, wrongly accused a victim of overzealous prosecutors, desperate to solve a high-profile case. Her trial would become a spectacle that captivated Minnesota. A battle between the prosecution's facts and the defense's theatrics. The outcome was far from certain. Chapter 8. Marjorie's Trial. Marjorie Congdon. Caldwell's trial began in April 1979 in Hastings, Minnesota, Dakota County. Another venue changed to escape the intense publicity that had saturated Duluth and surrounding areas. The prosecution faced a fundamental challenge. Roger had been at the crime scene. His fingerprints, his possession of stolen items, his injuries, physical connections to the murders. But Marjorie had been in Colorado, 1,500 miles away. She hadn't wielded the candlestick, hadn't suffocated her mother, hadn't touched anything at Glensheen that night. Proving she'd conspired to commit murder required showing intent, planning, that she'd encouraged, ordered, or aided Roger in the killings. Circumstantial cases are harder to win. Juries want direct proof, clear connections. Beyond reasonable doubt is a high standard when the defendant wasn't physically present. The prosecution built their argument around motive and timing, Marjorie's desperate financial situation, the foreclosed house, repossessed cars, hotel living, the trustees cutting her off from family money, the inheritance worth over $8 million that would pay out only after Elizabeth's death. Then came the damning documents. The power of attorney signed just 3 days before the murders, authorizing Roger to receive $2.5 million directly. Why sign such papers unless something was about to happen? Unless Roger was about to do something that earned him that money? Prosecutors presented the hitman rumor from March. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation had warned the Congdon trustees that Marjorie was looking for someone to kill her mother 3 months before it happened. The defense objected strenuously. Hearsay, unreliable, but the judge allowed it as showing state of mind. Rebecca Leroy testified against her own mother, described Marjorie's violence, the attempted strangulation, the pattern of manipulation and cruelty. It was devastating testimony. A daughter accusing her mother of being capable of murder. The marmalade incident came up. Years earlier, Elizabeth had become violently ill after eating marmalade Marjorie brought her. Blood tests showed drugs. The jar disappeared. Was it attempted murder that failed? Or innocent coincidence? The prosecution painted it as a previous attempt on Elizabeth's life. The house fire in Marine on St. Croix. Suspicious. Insurance investigation. Happening when the family was drowning in debt. Another pattern. Another suggestion that Marjorie would do anything for money. But the defense had a strategy, and it was brilliant. Ron Meshbesher, Marjorie's attorney, was one of Minnesota's best criminal defense lawyers. He understood that winning required more than refuting facts. It required making Marjorie sympathetic, making jurors like her want to acquit her. Marjorie dressed conservatively for court. Modest clothing, minimal jewelry. She looked like a middle-aged woman, not a murder conspirator. And she brought knitting. Every day sat at the defense table knitting quietly, looking harmless, grandmotherly, non-threatening. The knitting was genius. It created an image. This is what murderers look like? This woman calmly knitting? The contrast was powerful. Juries respond to visuals. To impressions, Marjorie looked nothing like someone who'd order her mother killed. Meshbesher attacked every piece of the prosecution's case. The power of attorney? Perfectly normal financial planning. Marjorie expected to inherit eventually. She was organizing her affairs. Nothing sinister about it. The hitman rumor? Unverified gossip. No actual hitman was ever found. No conversation recorded. Just third-hand information passed along by law enforcement. Hardly reliable. Rebecca Leroy's testimony? A troubled daughter with grudges against her mother. Their relationship had been contentious for years. Rebecca might say anything to hurt Marjorie. The marmalade incident happened years ago. Never investigated. Never proven. Bringing it up now was prejudicial. Trying to paint Marjorie as evil without actual proof. The house fire? Never solved. Insurance paid out. If arson had been proven, charges would have been filed. They weren't. It was speculation. Insinuation. Meshbesher's argument was simple. The prosecution had suspicions. Theories. A timeline that looked bad. But they didn't have proof. They couldn't show Marjorie telling Roger to kill anyone, couldn't produce phone records of planning conversations, couldn't demonstrate any direct involvement. Roger committed the murders. That was established. But maybe he did it on his own, without telling Marjorie, hoping to secure the inheritance that would save them both, acting independently, while she remained ignorant of his plans. Was that likely? Perhaps not. But the prosecution had to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Marjorie knew and participated. If the jury had any reasonable doubt, they had to acquit. The defense also planted seeds about Roger's conviction, suggested maybe he'd been framed too, that someone else committed the murders and set up both Caldwells. The theory didn't need to be convincing, it just needed to create doubt. Marjorie testified in her own defense. Risky. Prosecutors could cross-examine, but Meshbesher judged that jurors needed to hear from her directly, needed to see her as human sympathetic. She spoke about loving her mother, about the adoption, about feeling rejected by some family members who never fully accepted her as a real Congdon. She cried discussing Elizabeth's death, expressed shock that anyone thought she could hurt her mother. She explained the financial documents as innocent planning, said Roger must have acted alone, that she'd had no idea what he was planning, that she was as much a victim as anyone her mother was dead. Her husband was in prison. Her life was destroyed. The performance was convincing. Marjorie came across as wounded, confused, grieving, not as a cold-blooded killer who'd ordered her mother's murder. Prosecutors tried breaking her on cross-examination, asked about the finances, the debts, the desperation, the timing of everything, but Marjorie held firm, denied involvement, maintained that Roger had acted without her knowledge. Closing arguments laid out the contrasting views. The prosecution emphasized the totality, all the pieces together, the financial desperation, the timing, the inheritance, the power of attorney, the pattern of suspicious incidents. No single piece proved murder, but together they painted an undeniable picture. The defense countered with doubt. Circumstantial cases require speculation, assuming things not proven. The prosecution wanted jurors to believe Marjorie was evil, a woman who'd murder her own mother for money, but where was the proof? Where was the conversation where she told Roger to do it? Where was the planning, the direct involvement? The jury deliberated for 9 hours, then returned their verdict. Not guilty. All charges. Marjorie Congdon Caldwell walked free. The courtroom erupted. Some family members were devastated, outraged. How could she be acquitted? The prosecutor stood stunned. Marjorie smiled, hugged her attorney. After the trial, some jurors threw a party. They invited Marjorie. She attended, celebrated with the people who'd just acquitted her of murdering her mother. It was extraordinary, bizarre. Jurors who believe someone is innocent don't usually socialize with them afterward. But they liked Marjorie, the knitting, the demeanor. The performance had worked. The legal system had spoken. Roger Caldwell was guilty. Marjorie Caldwell was innocent. One person had committed 2 murders. The other had simply been married to him. Unfortunate, tragic, but not criminal. The Congdon family couldn't believe it. 4 of Marjorie's own children filed a civil suit. They contested her right to inherit. Argued she'd been involved in the murder even if a jury hadn't convicted her, that she shouldn't profit from Elizabeth's death. The civil case had a lower burden of proof. Preponderance of evidence rather than beyond reasonable doubt. The family thought they had a better chance in civil court, but the damage was done. Marjorie had been acquitted in criminal court. That verdict carried weight. Attacking her in civil proceedings looked vindictive, like the family couldn't accept the jury's decision. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Marjorie would receive income from the trusts, but limited. $40,000 per year, not the millions she'd expected. Not enough to live extravagantly, but enough to survive. The inheritance she'd supposedly killed for would never materialize. The legal battles had consumed years. The restrictions meant she'd never access the full $8 million Roger was in prison. The money was tied up. Everything they'd done had been for nothing. But Marjorie was free, not in prison, not convicted. In the eyes of the law, innocent. The question remained. Did she do it? Did she order her mother's murder? Or was she truly ignorant of Roger's plans? Most people who examined the case came to the same conclusion. Of course she was involved. The timing, the finances, the power of attorney. Roger wasn't smart enough to plan this alone. Marjorie was the brains. Roger was the tool. But proving it beyond reasonable doubt, that was the challenge. And the jury couldn't overcome reasonable doubt. Whether because Meshbesher was too good, or because Marjorie's performance was too convincing, or because the prosecution's case really did have holes. The result was the same. 2 women were dead. 1 man was in prison. And the woman who most likely orchestrated everything walked free. The story should have ended there, but it didn't. Because Marjorie Congdon Caldwell wasn't done causing problems. Her future would include more fires, more suspicious incidents, more legal troubles. The pattern that began at Glensheen would continue for decades. Chapter 9. Roger's Confession and Release. Roger Caldwell sat in Stillwater Prison serving 2 consecutive life sentences. No possibility of parole. He would die behind bars. That was the reality after his 1978 conviction. But legal battles continued. Appeals. Motions. Defense attorneys searching for any grounds to overturn the verdict. In criminal law, the fight doesn't end with conviction. It continues for years through appellate courts. Roger's lawyers found something. During Marjorie's trial in 1979, new information had emerged. Testimony and documents not available during Roger's trial. The defense argued this constituted newly discovered material that could have changed the outcome. Specifically, a witness named Candace Byers had testified in Marjorie's trial. She claimed to have information about other Congdon family members possibly being involved. Her testimony suggested alternative suspects, a possible frame-up, the kind of reasonable doubt Roger's jury never heard. The Minnesota Supreme Court reviewed the appeal. In 1982, they made a stunning decision. Roger Caldwell's conviction was overturned. The court ruled that the newly discovered information from Marjorie's trial could have affected the jury's verdict. He deserved a new trial. The prosecution faced a dilemma. Try Roger again? 5 years had passed since the murders. Witnesses might be unavailable. Memories faded. Physical materials could be challenged. And juries in retrials often sympathize with defendants who've already served time. Worse, Marjorie had been acquitted. How could they argue Roger conspired with someone the courts had found innocent? The legal logic became tangled. If Marjorie didn't order the murders, what was Roger's motive? The inheritance angle depended on Marjorie's involvement. The prosecution made a calculated decision. Offer a plea deal. Get Roger to confess. Avoid the risk of acquittal at retrial. On July 5, 1983, Roger Caldwell appeared in court. He accepted a plea bargain, pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. In exchange, his sentence would be time served 5 years. He'd be released immediately. Part of the deal required confession. Roger had to admit, on the record, that he'd killed Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Piatila. No more claims of innocence. No more frame-up theories. Roger confessed. Said he'd traveled to Minnesota, entered Glensheen through the billiard room window, encountered Velma Piatila on the staircase, beat her to death with the candlestick when upstairs, suffocated Elizabeth with a pillow, took the jewelry box, drove Velma's car to the airport, flew back to Colorado. The confession answered some questions, created others. How had he traveled without leaving airline records? Roger claimed he'd used cash and possibly fake identification. The details remained vague, but the core admission was clear. He'd done it, both murders, exactly as the prosecution had argued. What the confession didn't address was Marjorie's involvement. Roger didn't implicate her, didn't say she'd ordered it, didn't describe planning conversations. His confession made it sound like he'd acted alone, decided independently to kill his mother-in-law for the inheritance money. That struck many observers as absurd. Roger Caldwell wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was an unemployed salesman living in a hotel. The idea that he'd conceived and executed this plan without Marjorie's knowledge defied belief. But the legal system had spoken. Marjorie was innocent. Roger was guilty. Those were the facts according to the courts. Whether they matched reality was a different question. Roger Caldwell walked out of Stillwater Prison in July 1983, after 5 years inside. He was 50 years old. His life was destroyed. His wife was still legally married to him, though their relationship had deteriorated. The money they'd killed for never materialized. He tried rebuilding, finding work, creating some kind of normal existence, but the past followed him. Everyone knew who he was, what he'd done. The Glensheen murderer, the man who'd killed an elderly disabled woman and her nurse for money. Roger struggled with depression, alcoholism, the weight of what he'd done, or maybe the weight of taking all the blame while Marjorie walked free, the bitterness of serving time while she collected $40,000 annually from the trust he'd tried to secure. On May 18, 1988, Roger Caldwell committed suicide. He was 55 years old. The method was poison. He left no note explaining his decision. No final confession implicating Marjorie or anyone else, just death, an end to whatever torment had consumed him. Some saw it as guilt, the burden of 2 murders finally overwhelming him. Others saw it as despair, a ruined life with no path forward. Still others wondered if he'd been pressured, if someone wanted him dead before he could change his story. The truth died with Roger. Whatever he knew about Marjorie's involvement, whatever really happened that planning phase, whether he'd acted alone or followed orders, all of it went to the grave. Marjorie continued living. The inheritance restrictions meant she couldn't access millions, but $40,000 annually was enough to survive. She'd remarried, Wallace Hagen. He became her 3rd husband, though it later emerged she'd never properly divorced Roger. Bigamy. Another crime, another pattern. In 1982, the house she shared with Wallace burned down. Another suspicious fire, another insurance claim. Investigators suspected arson. The pattern from Marine on St. Croix repeated house fire. Financial problems, insurance payout. Marjorie was charged with arson. This time, unlike the murder charges, she was convicted. Sentenced to prison. She served 21 months before release. More incidents followed. Forgery, theft, fraud. Marjorie kept getting arrested, kept appearing in court. The woman who'd beaten a double murder charge couldn't stay out of trouble for lesser crimes. Her children remained estranged. Most wanted nothing to do with her. Rebecca, who'd testified against her in the murder trial, never reconciled. The relationship was destroyed. Other children maintained distance, protecting themselves from her chaos. Jennifer, Marjorie's adopted sister, lived quietly. She'd inherited her share of the estate without restrictions, maintained good relationships with other Congdon relatives, lived the kind of stable life Marjorie never could. The contrast between the 2 adopted daughters was stark, both raised in the same house, given the same advantages. One became a responsible adult, the other became a criminal whose pattern of suspicious incidents stretched across decades. Glensheen opened as a museum in July 1979, 2 years after the murders. The University of Minnesota Duluth operated it as promised. Tours were offered. Visitors could walk through the rooms where Chester and Clara Congdon had lived, where their children grew up, where Elizabeth spent her entire life. Initially, tour guides were instructed not to mention the murders. The university wanted Glensheen appreciated for its architecture and history. Not sensationalized as a crime scene, they feared becoming a dark tourism destination, but visitors knew. Everyone knew. The murders were famous. People came specifically because of them. Pretending they hadn't happened seemed pointless. Eventually, the policy changed. Guides acknowledged the murders, answered questions. The story became part of Glensheen's history. Not the only history, but impossible to ignore. The mansion attracted over 100,000 visitors annually. Most came for the beauty, the architecture, the gardens, the glimpse into Gilded Age wealth. Some came for the murder story, the dark ending to a family saga. Glensheen stood as it had for decades. Original furnishings, original artwork. 95% of what visitors saw dated to 1908, when the Congdons moved in. It was a time capsule, perfectly preserved. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Chester Congdon built this house to last for generations, to establish family legacy, to create something permanent, and it had survived. The mansion endured, beautifully maintained, protected by the university. But the family was destroyed. Chester's fortune split among distant relatives. His youngest daughter murdered in her bedroom. His adopted granddaughter probably responsible, his name associated with one of Minnesota's most notorious crimes. The house outlasted the people. The dream outlived the dreamers. Glensheen stood while the Congdon family collapsed around it. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Murder. Marjorie Congdon Caldwell didn't fade quietly into obscurity after Roger's death. The pattern that defined her life continued. More crimes, more arrests, more courtrooms. In 1992, Wallace Hagan died, Marjorie's third husband. The circumstances raised questions, though no charges were filed. Another death near Marjorie. Another convenient outcome. The suspicions followed her everywhere. She moved to Arizona. Tucson area, distance from Minnesota, distance from the Congdon name, distance from Glensheen. But she couldn't escape her past, or her patterns. In 2007, Marjorie was arrested again. Fraud charges. She'd been writing checks on a friend's account, forging signatures, stealing money. The amounts weren't huge by Congdon fortune standards, but theft is theft. The legal process dragged on. Delays, continuances. Marjorie's health declined, surgery was scheduled, the trial kept getting postponed, she was 75 years old, still causing problems, still facing criminal charges. By 2010, Marjorie was largely confined to Arizona. Her children remained estranged. The Congdon family wanted nothing to do with her. She lived on the trust income $40,000 annually. The inheritance she'd possibly killed for had never materialized in any meaningful way. She gave occasional interviews over the years. Always maintained her innocence regarding the murders. Always claimed Roger acted alone. Always portrayed herself as a victim, a woman wrongly accused. A daughter who lost her mother to a husband's violence. No one believed her. The evidence, the timing, the patterns. Everything pointed to her involvement. But she'd been acquitted. The legal system had spoken. She could claim innocence forever without fear of being tried again. Double jeopardy protected her. Jennifer Johnson, Marjorie's adopted sister, lived until 2017. She died at 82. She'd maintained throughout her life that Marjorie was guilty, that her sister had orchestrated their mother's murder. The family division never healed. The 4 children who'd sued Marjorie in civil court never reconciled with their mother. Rebecca Leroy, who testified against her, never spoke to Marjorie again. The family was permanently fractured, trust destroyed, relationships impossible. Marjorie's story became a Minnesota legend. Books were written, television shows produced, investigation discovery featured the case. Behind Mansion Walls dedicated an episode to the Glensheen murders. The story was too compelling to ignore. Wealth, adoption, greed, murder, acquittal. All the elements of true crime drama. Joe Kimball, the reporter who covered the case from the beginning, wrote extensively about it. His accounts became the definitive journalism on the murders. He interviewed family members, reviewed court documents, built a comprehensive picture of what happened. Kimball's conclusion matched most observers. Marjorie was guilty. She'd planned it. Roger had executed it. The acquittal was a failure of the justice system. Good defense lawyering, sympathetic presentation. Reasonable doubt where none should have existed, but proving it? That ship had sailed. Marjorie would never face trial again. The legal protection was absolute. She could admit involvement tomorrow and nothing would happen. The courts had finished with her. Glensheen thrived as a museum. The University of Minnesota Duluth invested in preservation, restoration work, garden maintenance. The estate looked as close to 1908 condition as possible. Visitors saw what Chester and Clara Congdon had created. The vision made real. Tours expanded over the years. Different options became available. Classic tours showing the main rooms. Extended tours including upper floors and servants' quarters. Holiday tours with seasonal decorations. Behind-the-scenes tours showing areas normally closed to the public. The murder story became integrated into the experience, not emphasized. not sensationalized, but acknowledged. Visitors asked questions. Guides provided factual answers. The bedroom where Elizabeth died, the staircase where Velma fell, the window Roger supposedly entered through. All part of the history now. Some family members objected to this. They felt Glensheen should be remembered for Chester's accomplishments, for the architecture, for the family's contributions to Duluth, not for murder, not for the worst moment in the estate's history. But the university balanced it well. The focus remained on the house, the craftsmanship, the preservation. The murders were mentioned but not dwelled on. Glensheen succeeded as an architectural museum first. The crime was context, not the main story. The mansion appeared on the National Register of Historic Places, recognized for architectural significance. One of the finest examples of Jacobean Revival design in America, remarkably intact. 95% original furnishings and fixtures, a genuine time capsule from the early 20th century. School groups visited regularly, field trips to see how wealthy families lived during the Gilded Age, to understand Minnesota's mining history, to learn about landscape architecture and interior design. Educational programming became a core mission. Weddings were held on the grounds. The gardens provided beautiful settings. Couples posed for photos with Lake Superior in the background. The terraces Levitt designed in 1905 still functioned as intended, beauty accessible to everyone now, not just the Congdon family. The boathouse remained on the property, restored, maintained, a reminder that this had been a working estate, self-sufficient, producing its own food and managing its own operations. Not just a showpiece, a functioning household for a large family and staff. Chester Congdon's vision had succeeded in an unexpected way. He'd wanted to create something lasting, something that would serve his family for generations. The family part failed, Elizabeth murdered, Marjorie disgraced, the Congdon name associated with crime rather than philanthropy. But the house? The house survived. Better than survived. It thrived. Shared with the public, preserved permanently, visited by hundreds of thousands, appreciated for its beauty and craftsmanship. Chester's legacy lived on through the architecture, through the estate he built. The irony was profound. Everything Chester worked for, the fortune, the family position, the lasting dynasty, all of it collapsed, but the building endured. The physical structure outlasted the family structure. Stone and wood proved more durable than blood and inheritance. Duluth embraced Glensheen as a landmark, tourist attraction, source of pride. The mansion represented the city's history, the mining wealth that built the region, the ambition and vision of early 20th century entrepreneurs. It was Duluth's connection to the Gilded Age, to a time when the city was booming and the future seemed limitless. The Congdon name remained prominent in Duluth. Streets, buildings, parks. Chester's contributions to the city were real and lasting. The park system he helped develop, the roads he funded, the civic improvements he supported. Those achievements weren't erased by murder 70 years later. But the family was gone, scattered. No Congdons lived in Duluth anymore. The fortune was dispersed among distant relatives. The name continued only in historical context, in museum placards, in tour guide scripts, in books about Minnesota history. Chester built Glensheen in 1908 with dreams of multi-generational occupation, of Congdon children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filling those 39 rooms, of family gatherings on the terraces, of traditions passed down through decades. It lasted one generation beyond him. Clara lived there until 1950, Elizabeth until 1977, 69 years of Congdon occupation. Then it ended. The family left. The university took over. The dream was finished. But the house remained. Will remain. Protected by institutional ownership. Maintained with university resources. Open to the public forever. Chester's physical legacy secured even as his family legacy disintegrated. The murders will always be part of Glensheen's story. Impossible to separate. The most dramatic moment in the estate's history. 2 women killed in a house built for beauty and family harmony. The corruption of everything Chester intended. Yet visitors leave Glensheen impressed by beauty more than darkness. The architecture dominates, the gardens, the craftsmanship. The murders are a footnote, important, memorable, but not defining. The house is bigger than the crime. That might be the final irony. Marjorie tried to claim the Congdon fortune by murdering her mother. Got nothing. Lived on restricted trust income. Ended up in Arizona facing fraud charges in old age. The murder accomplished nothing for her. But it made Glensheen famous, brought attention to the estate, drew visitors who might never have come otherwise. The crime Marjorie committed to get money ended up benefiting the house she tried to inherit. Not her. The house. Chester would have appreciated that. His mansion surviving, thriving, becoming more than he imagined, open to everyone, a public treasure rather than a private residence. The house won, the greed lost, the beauty endured. That's the legacy of murder at Glensheen. Not just tragedy, also triumph. The triumph of preservation over destruction, of beauty over greed, of architecture over family dysfunction. The house Chester built survived everything, including murder, and it will stand long after everyone involved is forgotten.